The Texas sun was merciless, baking the ground into cracked earth and turning the air into a shimmering haze. Inside the dusty round pen of Miller Ranch, the world had narrowed to the pounding hooves of a wild black stallion, Midnight Saint. The massive Friesian reared up, slicing the sky with his front legs, eyes burning with rage and rebellion. A crowd of ranch hands leaned on the fence, their boots rooted in silence, their eyes glued to the figure in the arena. An older man stood alone, hat pulled low, his posture calm and unmoved. Harlan Creed wasn't there to prove anything, but that's exactly what he would do. Off to the side, watching with a smirk carved across his face, was Thorne Miller, heir to the land, the name and the arrogance that came with both. Dressed sharp, talking loud, he let his voice cut through the tension. "Y'all get ready. Creed's about to show us how not to break a horse. Somebody get a medic ready in case he breaks a hip instead." Laughter rippled through the group, shallow and uncertain. But Harlan didn't flinch. His weathered face gave away nothing. His eyes were locked on the beast before him, reading him, feeling him, like a man listening to music no one else could hear. Midnight Saint bucked and twisted, flinging dust in every direction. His muscles rippled like coiled rope, and yet he hesitated, just for a moment. As Harlan stepped forward and let out a low whistle, something in the horse shifted. The stallion's ears flicked. The rage didn't vanish, but it changed shape, like it had been recognized. Harlan didn't raise a hand or shout. He simply stepped closer, slow and steady, the way only a man who's buried more friends than he's made could do. With one hand, he brushed Midnight Saint's neck, the touch of someone who knew pain and patience in equal measure. Then he mounted. Smooth. Silent. No grand gesture. Just presence. The horse snorted, but didn't explode. Instead, he walked. One step. Then another. And then a full trot. Like a memory being dusted off and brought back to life. Thorne's smile faltered. His boots shifted in the dirt. Creed guided the stallion in a wide arc, then brought him to a stop directly in front of the fence. He didn't raise his voice. "You don't break a horse like this with power," he said, his voice gravel and thunder. "You earn his trust. And trust don't come cheap." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind moving through the pens, and the quiet breaking in Thorne Miller's pride. Something had shifted, and though no one said it aloud, every man there felt it. This was no trick, no show. This was a reckoning. The dust had settled, but the silence hadn't. After Harlan Creed dismounted, Midnight Saint stood still beside him, head lowered, muscles calm. No one clapped. No one spoke. It was as if the moment had peeled back a curtain none of them were ready to look behind. Thorne Miller, jaw clenched and hands balled at his sides, turned without a word and walked off toward the stables. The crowd followed, whispering. Some glanced back at Harlan, others couldn't. What they'd seen wasn't just a man taming a horse. It felt like something deeper, like a man taming a piece of himself. Alone in the round pen, Harlan slowly removed his hat and ran a hand through his silver hair. The sun pressed hard on his skin, but his thoughts were elsewhere, far from the ranch, far from that stallion. He stared out over the fence line toward the hills, where the wind always seemed to carry echoes from the past. And in those echoes, he heard her name again. Mae. It had been 30 years, maybe more. But her voice still lingered like smoke in a church. She was the reason he'd left this place. And maybe the reason he'd returned. Back in the barn, Thorne ripped off his gloves and threw them into the dirt. His face was flushed, his breathing sharp. "Why the hell did my father ever trust that man?" he spat. Coy Maddox, one of his oldest ranch hands, shrugged. "That ain't for me to say, boss. But your daddy, he used to call Harlan the best horseman west of the Pecos. Said the man could talk to beasts like he knew their secrets." Thorne didn't want to hear it. He didn't believe in legends. He believed in ownership, in control, and Harlan Creed had just stolen the respect of every man on his land. Harlan, meanwhile, made his way toward the old bunkhouse. Most of the new crew didn't know it had once been his home. Inside, the air was musty, thick with time. Dust floated like memory. He sat on the edge of a cot that hadn't held him in decades. His fingers traced the etchings on the wooden wall, initials carved into it like scars, HC plus ML. He swallowed hard. Mae Lynn Miller. Thorne's aunt. His first love. And the secret that could ruin everything if it ever came to light. The truth was simple. Harlan had once been part of this family. Not by blood, but by something stronger. By love. And when things fell apart, they fell hard. There was betrayal. There was silence. And there was a promise made that night, one he'd kept. Until now. Outside, the wind picked up. It carried dust. And maybe it carried something else. The past, Harlan knew, never stayed buried forever. And in a place like this, the dead had a way of whispering through wood, through hoofbeats, through every angry breath a man like Thorne took. Something was coming. And it wasn't just about a horse. Thorne Miller didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in the ranch house kitchen, a glass of bourbon sweating in his hand, the ice long melted. The ticking of the old wall clock felt louder than ever, like a countdown. The image of Harlan Creed atop Midnight Saint looped in his mind like a film he couldn't shut off. It wasn't just the way the stallion obeyed. It was the way the others looked at him afterward, like they'd seen something holy. Something Thorne would never be. And that burned deeper than he was ready to admit. In the barn, the horses stirred, restless. Midnight Saint paced in his stall, calmer than ever, yet aware. Animals always sensed when men were close to breaking. Harlan stood outside, under the open sky, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, the red tip glowing like an ember of old rage. He'd felt Thorne's stare burn through him earlier, same as his father's had all those years ago. And deep down, Harlan knew it wasn't over. Thorne wasn't just angry, he was threatened. And a man like Thorne didn't let that go. Not without blood. At dawn, Thorne walked the fence line alone, boots kicking through the high grass, eyes scanning the horizon. He found himself back at the old creek, the one behind the bunkhouse, half dried up now. It was here that his father, Barrett Miller, used to meet with Harlan in secret. He remembered stumbling across them once as a boy, the two men speaking in hushed tones, voices sharp. Something about Mae Lynn. Something about shame. He hadn't understood then. But now, the pieces were forming a picture he didn't like. A picture where Harlan Creed wasn't just a threat to his pride, he was a threat to his legacy. Later that morning, word spread fast across the ranch. Thorne had ordered Midnight Saint to be locked and chained in the far stall, away from all other horses. No one was to touch him. No one, not even Creed. The hands exchanged glances but obeyed. Coy Maddox, though, lingered a moment too long after the order. He watched Harlan from across the yard and saw something in the old man's eyes. Not fear, but something colder. A calm before the storm. Harlan said nothing. He didn't protest. He simply returned to the bunkhouse and opened an old leather satchel he'd carried since the 80s. Inside, beneath yellowed photographs and a folded letter with Mae Lynn's handwriting, was a small, tarnished revolver. He hadn't touched it in decades. But something about Thorne's move had awakened the past in full force. Some debts are paid with words. Others, with silence. But the ones that fester in the dark, those are paid in dust and blood. And Harlan Creed had never been a man to run twice. The morning heat was already pressing down on the ranch like a punishment from above. Dust clung to every surface, as if the land itself had stopped breathing. Inside the bunkhouse, Harlan Creed sat at the edge of his cot, the faded letter from Mae Lynn trembling slightly between his fingers. Her handwriting was delicate but rushed, the kind of letter you write when you don't have time to think, only to feel. He'd read it 100 times, but this time, the words felt heavier. If anything happens to me, you'll know why. And you'll know who. The creak of floorboards outside snapped Harlan's attention back to the present. Coy Maddox stood in the doorway, hat in hand, a strange look on his face. "You might wanna know. Thorne's riding into town," he said. "Said he's meeting the lawyer. Digging through old family records." Harlan didn't answer. He didn't need to. If Thorne was looking into the past, it meant he'd found enough breadcrumbs to start chasing the truth. About Mae, about that summer, about the child that was never spoken of again. Harlan folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the satchel like a loaded weapon. Out in the barn, Midnight Saint stood still as a statue, chained and isolated, his breath heavy and slow. The other horses had been moved out of earshot. Coy leaned against the gate, watching him. He'd seen a lot of animals come and go in his years, but something about this stallion made his skin itch, like the horse was waiting. Not for freedom. For vengeance. Coy lit a cigarette, glancing back at the house. "This ain't gonna end clean," he muttered to himself. Thorne returned just before sundown. His boots were dirty, his eyes sharp, and his jaw tight as stone. He didn't speak to anyone. He just walked straight into his father's old office and slammed the door. Inside, papers were spread across the desk, property deeds, handwritten wills, and an old family Bible with names scribbled in fading ink. He found it. Right there, buried in the back pages. A name he never expected. Mae Lynn Miller Creed. His aunt had married Harlan in secret. And beneath that, one more name, Elijah Creed, born 1991. Thorne's hands trembled. A son. His cousin. Hidden for over 30 years. Lied about. Erased. And suddenly everything made sense. The tension, the silence, the look in Harlan's eyes when he stepped back onto this land. This wasn't about a horse. It was about what was taken, what was buried, and what was coming back to collect. And now, for the first time, Thorne Miller was afraid. The ranch was quiet that night, too quiet. Even the wind held its breath. A storm hadn't hit yet, but the air crackled with that kind of tension, like nature itself knew something was about to break. Harlan Creed stood alone under the awning of the bunkhouse, the glow of his cigarette barely visible in the dark. He wasn't a praying man, but tonight he whispered something to the stars. Not a prayer. A warning. He could feel it. Something was coming down the road. And it carried his blood. Inside the main house, Thorne Miller stared at the papers on the desk like they were a loaded gun. Mae Lynn's name. The child. A marriage certificate signed in El Paso. It wasn't just betrayal. It was history rewritten. And worst of all, his father knew. The signature was there. Barrett Miller had witnessed the marriage and helped bury it. Thorne's grip on the edge of the desk tightened until the wood creaked. All his life he thought he was protecting a legacy. But maybe he was guarding a lie. The sound of tires on gravel cut through the silence. Headlights crept up the long dirt road toward the ranch house. Harlan stepped out into the open, squinting against the beams. A truck, dark green, dusty, unfamiliar. The engine rumbled low as it pulled to a stop. The door opened slowly. From it stepped a young man, no older than 30. Tall, broad-shouldered, hair dark and wavy. Eyes, those same cold blue eyes that had once belonged to Harlan in his youth. Elijah Creed. He didn't speak at first. Just looked at Harlan, studied him. Harlan didn't move either. Two strangers, and yet not. Coy Maddox stood off to the side, watching from the shadows. He didn't know what was being said in that silence, but he knew he was witnessing something ancient. A reunion carved in blood and regret. Back in the house, Thorne saw the truck through the window, and when he saw the man who stepped out of it, his face went pale. He knew instantly. The resemblance was too strong, the bloodline too clear. His hand moved instinctively toward the drawer where his father's old revolver rested. This wasn't just a family matter anymore. It was war. Outside, Elijah finally spoke. His voice was steady, low, with just a hint of southern drawl. "You're Harlan Creed." Harlan nodded once. "And you're the reason I came back." The wind picked up. The night grew heavier. And somewhere deep inside that silence, the past finally caught up with the present. The following morning broke cold, despite the Texas sun trying to rise hot and proud. The ranch felt different, like it had shifted in the night. Men whispered instead of joked. The horses were restless, kicking at their stalls like they knew something sacred had been disturbed. Elijah Creed stood near the old corral, staring out over land he'd never walked, yet somehow felt bound to. His presence stirred every shadow on the property. He wasn't loud. He didn't posture. But just being there made things feel inevitable. Thorne Miller hadn't come out of the house. Not yet. But the gun in the top drawer had been loaded before sunrise. He'd watched Elijah from behind the curtains for over an hour, watching the way he walked, the way the ranch hands greeted him with caution, almost with respect. And Thorne hated that. He'd worked his whole life to control this land, these men, this legacy. And now one stranger, with the Creed name, with Mae Lynn's eyes, threatened to unravel it all. In the barn, Harlan finished brushing down Midnight Saint. The stallion had calmed since Elijah arrived, like he recognized something familiar in the boy's scent. Harlan said nothing, but his hands moved slower, more deliberate. He knew the time was coming. The silence between him and his son had lasted decades, a silence born from protection, then guilt, then shame. But now it had to end. He turned to Elijah, who stood watching from the doorway. "He knows who you are now," Harlan said. Elijah nodded, his face unreadable. "And?" Harlan sighed. "Now he has to decide who he wants to be." The door to the main house creaked open. Thorne stepped out, revolver hanging loosely in one hand. The look on his face was cold and unreadable, but his knuckles were white. Coy Maddox saw it from across the yard and started moving fast, but he knew he wouldn't reach them in time. Harlan stepped forward, putting himself between Thorne and Elijah. "Don't do this," he said, low and hard. "You've already buried too much. Don't add blood to the list." Thorne's hand shook slightly, but his pride screamed louder than his fear. "He doesn't belong here. None of you do." Elijah stepped forward, calm. "I didn't come to take anything. I came for the truth." Thorne raised the gun. "Then here it is." And in that breathless moment, before the trigger pulled, before the heir could scream, a gunshot echoed. But not from Thorne's hand. The crack of the gunshot shattered the morning air like a bone snapping clean. Birds scattered from the trees. Horses neighed wildly in their stalls. For one long second, no one moved. Then Thorne Miller's revolver dropped to the dirt with a heavy thud, untouched by his hand. He stood frozen, eyes wide, not in pain, but in shock. The bullet hadn't come from him. It had come from behind. Standing 10 feet away, arms trembling, was Coy Maddox, his rifle still smoking. His chest heaved with each breath, eyes locked on Thorne like a man who'd finally crossed a line he swore he never would. "I told you," Coy said, voice shaking. "This ain't your war to fight, Thorne. Not anymore." The bullet had struck the ground near Thorne's feet, a warning, not a kill. But it was enough to break whatever madness had taken hold. Harlan Creed stepped forward first, reaching down to pick up Thorne's revolver before he could. He handed it, without a word, to Coy, who took it like it weighed more than steel. Thorne didn't speak. His face was pale, The rage drained from him, replaced by something darker, humiliation. He looked at Elijah, who hadn't flinched. Not once. That same fire that had burned in Mae Lynn's eyes lived in him, quiet but unyielding. It terrified Thorne more than any gun ever could. The ranch hands began to appear from behind stalls, fences, shadows. No one spoke. No one needed to. They had all seen it. And in a place like Miller Ranch, what men didn't say often spoke louder than gunfire. Thorne turned slowly, locking eyes with Harlan one last time. "You came back here to steal my legacy," he muttered. Harlan didn't blink. "No," he said. "I came back to show him the truth, so he wouldn't become like us." Thorne clenched his jaw, then walked away. Not fast. Not proud. Just broken. Elijah stood still for a moment, letting the dust settle. Then he turned to Coy. "Thank you," he said simply. Coy nodded, but didn't meet his eyes. The old cowboy had just chosen a side, and he knew there'd be a cost. Harlan stepped beside his son. They didn't hug, didn't shake hands, but they stood together, and somehow that said more. In the silence that followed, the wind picked up again. It carried away the tension like smoke from a barrel. But the damage was done. A line had been drawn. And now, there was no turning back. The ranch returned to motion, but not to peace. The day moved on like a limp horse, slow, uneasy, and favoring one side. Thorne Miller hadn't been seen since he disappeared into the house. No one dared approach. Doors stayed closed, and voices stayed low. In the barn, tools clanged and hooves thudded, but it all felt muted, like the heart of the place had been kicked out of rhythm. Elijah Creed, still dusty from the morning's confrontation, sat on the back steps of the bunkhouse, watching the land stretch out before him. It looked endless, and yet it felt like a trap. Harlan joined him without a word. He sat slowly, every movement weighted by years and regrets. The silence between father and son wasn't hostile. It was sacred. Words could ruin it. But after a few minutes, Elijah spoke. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice wasn't angry, just tired, wounded in a quiet way. Harlan looked out toward the distant hills, his jaw set. "Because your mother asked me not to," he said finally. "She thought it'd protect you. She thought keeping you away from this place was the only way to break the curse." Elijah shook his head slowly. "And yet here I am." Harlan let out a dry, bitter laugh. "Yeah, guess blood's a rope that always pulls you home." For a moment, they both stared into the same distance, seeing different ghosts. Elijah didn't need to ask what curse his father meant. He'd seen enough in a single day, the hatred, the silence, the violence, to know that Miller Ranch was built on more than cattle and barbed wire. It was built on buried truths and unpaid debts. Inside the main house, Thorne sat at his father's old desk, the revolver now locked in the drawer again. He stared at an old photo of Barrett Miller, Mae Lynn, and a younger Harlan, smiling, arms slung over each other's shoulders. He didn't understand it. He didn't want to. All he knew was that something had been stolen from him. Or maybe something he'd been taught to guard never really belonged to him at all. Back outside, Elijah stood and dusted off his jeans. "I'm not here to fight for land," he said. "I don't want the ranch. I just want to know who I am, and what kind of man I'm supposed to be." Harlan looked up at him, the corners of his eyes creased with something close to pride. "Then stay long enough to find out," he said. "The land ain't yours. But the truth? That always was." The sun dipped low behind the hills. And for the first time, father and son stood on the same ground, not as strangers, but as survivors of the same storm. The sky over Miller Ranch turned gray that morning, not with rain, but with tension. Thick, slow-moving clouds cast long shadows across the land, as if the past had decided to lower itself down and settle over the place for good. In the barn, the hands worked quieter than usual. They kept their eyes down, but their ears open. Everyone knew something was building again. Something final. And at the center of it was Thorne Miller, pacing his father's old office like a caged wolf. He had made a decision. One last move. One that would put the story back in his hands. In front of him, on the desk, was a deed, the land transfer papers. Next to it sat an envelope, sealed and addressed to a lawyer in Austin. The idea was simple: force Elijah off the land before he even had the chance to decide whether he wanted it. Thorne hadn't told anyone, not even Coy. But Coy had been around long enough to smell a storm before it hit. And this one smelled like pride. And desperation. Elijah Creed, unaware of Thorne's plan, had spent the morning in the far pasture, walking the fence line with Harlan. The two men didn't talk much, but what was left unsaid had begun to form something stronger than blood, understanding. "He won't let this go," Elijah said at one point. Harlan nodded. "Then you don't fight him with fists. You fight him by standing your ground and not turning into him." Elijah nodded, but his jaw clenched tight. He knew it wasn't that easy. He knew that some men only understood one thing: control. Just before sundown, a courier truck rolled up the drive, rare for the ranch. The driver handed a thick manila envelope to Coy Maddox, who opened it on instinct. When he saw the letterhead, his stomach turned. The papers were legal. Formal. Thorne had filed a claim, asserting that Elijah Creed had no right to step foot on the property. No mention of blood. No mention of truth. Just law and ink. Coy didn't bring the papers to Thorne. He brought them straight to Harlan. And Harlan, in turn, handed them to Elijah. The younger man stared at them for a long time, his fingers tightening with every line he read. "So this is how it ends," he muttered. Harlan stepped closer. "No," he said. "This is how it begins. But only if you decide not to walk away." That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He stood by the fence line, watching the house from a distance, the papers still in his hands. The truth had found him. The blood had called him home. And in the quiet of that final Texas night, he made his choice. The next morning broke clean and golden, as if the land itself had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. For the first time in weeks, the sun poured down without anger, and the wind moved gentle across the hills. Elijah Creed stood on the porch of the bunkhouse, his decision made, his shoulders squared. In his hands were the legal papers Thorne had filed, now torn neatly in half. He didn't need a lawyer. He didn't need a courtroom. What he needed was something no document could give him: peace. Thorne Miller stepped out from the main house just as Elijah began walking toward him. They locked eyes across the yard, the final standoff, not of fists or firearms, but of truths long buried. Thorne's face was tired, his pride cracked, his anger reduced to embers. "You came here to take what's mine," he said, almost without venom now. Elijah stopped a few feet away. "I didn't come to take anything. I came to see what I was made of. Turns out, it wasn't hate." Thorne looked away, as if the words cut deeper than a bullet ever could. From the barn, Harlan watched silently, leaning against a post. He'd lived long enough to know that some endings don't come with thunder, they come with choice. And his son had just made one. Elijah didn't want the land. He didn't want revenge. He wanted to break the cycle. And in doing so, he'd reclaimed something far greater than a piece of earth. He'd reclaimed his name. Elijah walked past Thorne, heading for his truck. He paused just once, turning back. "Whatever this place meant to you, keep it," he said. "But remember, it also belonged to people you tried to forget." With that, he climbed into the truck and drove off, the dust rising behind him like a trail of ghosts finally released. Thorne stood alone in the silence, papers at his feet, the weight of what he'd lost finally settling in. Back in the bunkhouse, Harlan sat on the edge of the same cot where his journey had restarted. He looked down at a photo of Mae Lynn, still tucked in his satchel. "He did what we couldn't," he whispered. "He let go." And in that moment, for the first time in decades, Harlan Creed smiled, not because he'd won anything, but because something broken had finally begun to heal. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across Miller Ranch, one truth remained. Sometimes the strongest legacy isn't land or blood, it's the courage to walk away free.